exacerbates the cycle of boom and bust. That constructive fraud finances and thereby intensifies the very evils of democracy, devote a full chapter to it, the welfare and the warfare. As much as anything in Europe today is a crisis of welfare, in the United States we're seeing a crisis both of welfare and of warfare. This is all very small print, for which I apologize. The critical point, many of you have read it, the article, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, written by Mises in 1920, a book-length elaboration of it called Socialism, published in 1921. What does that have to do with the GFC? Well, things of which I've spoken. What is central banking if it is not socialism? What is central banking if it is not central planning? Walk down the street in Martin Place, elsewhere in Sydney, elsewhere in this country, in America, England, etc., etc. And as I do, I go to the American Finance Association meetings virtually every year, and there are folks who loudly claim to be free market people, that they are right-wing, all the rest of it, the usual rhetoric, I'm a Republican, etc., in the American context, and yet they balk at the notion of any criticism, never mind an abolition of a central bank, that they are deeply, deeply, deeply infected with the virus of central planning. Their God is not the God of the carpenter of Nazareth who came to atone for our sins. Their God is Mars, the god of war, who comes to bomb women and children. He who is a central banker is a central planner. If socialism fails, if it failed in the Soviet Union and in the ex-Soviet bloc, then please tell me why it is not failing, has been failing as we speak, at the corner of Constitution and 21st in London and here in Martin Place. In that sense, I'm saying nothing, absolutely nothing new. I'm simply making the linkage. If in fact you oppose central planning, then by force of very simple logic, you must also oppose central banking. I'll add a bit of empirical flesh to points that have already been made by Professor Hopper and by Andrew. And that point is basically this. Since the beginning of the 20th century, central banks have been utterly unable to provide a stable monetary and financial system. They are the authors of economic, financial, monetary chaos. For starters, they've destroyed their respective currencies' purchasing power. This is a graph which plots the purchasing power of the Australian currency, be it the pound pre-decimalisation and the dollar since 66, 67, and the US dollar. It is a happy coincidence that central banking, or something vaguely resembling it through the Commonwealth Bank, can be traced to the period just before the First World War in this country and the enactment of the Federal Reserve Act in Washington in December of 1913. It plots purchasing power in Australia and the USA since 1913. By purchasing power, I basically mean how much of a comparable good over time does a unit of currency purchase? How many Granny Smith apples in 1913 versus how many Granny Smith apples today? And the point is that since 1913, the purchasing power of both the US dollar and the Australian dollar and the pound, which preceded it, has fallen basically by 99%, something close to that, 96, 97, close to 99%. The big culprit, as you'll see, the steepest part of the line, during the First World War. A theme of the book, it's explored in reasonable detail, is that it is a central bank which finances the war, not just the welfare, but also the warfare. And particularly since the formal abrogation of gold, of a gold exchange standard, technically speaking, in the early 1930s, it's been all downhill since then. There was the 1920s characterized by an increase of purchasing power, but since then it's been virtually relentlessly in one direction, such that the currency which bought you 20 Granny Smith apples in 1913 buys you less than one today. There's more than correlation going on here, there's causation going on here, it seems to me. I've simply taken the same data, I'll show you the source of the data in just a minute, and I take them back to, in the old country, the UK, and in the US, back to 1800. And the basic story here, notice the bifurcation up to roughly the time, well, basically 1913. During the First World War, obviously, the Bank of England left a formal gold standard. Yes, it undertook open market operations before then, but in a relatively limited way. It did so in a wholehearted way, beginning during the First World War. Notice that since then, in both countries, the purchasing power of the currency has collapsed. Notice that during the 19th century, and particularly from about 1830 or thereabouts, with one exception in the United States, the purchasing power of the currency didn't just rise, it doubled. So the unit of currency that bought you one Granny Smith apple in 1800 bought you, count them, 2 apples by the turn of the 20th century. That one exception, of course, being in the United States in the War of Northern Aggression from 1860 to 1865, in which the purchasing power suddenly and dramatically collapsed for obvious reasons. The phrase greenback, often used as a description for the American currency, originated then, backed by nothing apart from the sheer force of evil Abraham Lincoln. A recovery as America returned to something resembling a collateralized currency in the 1870s, and then, as I've said already, downhill since then. The British story is even of greater stability from roughly the 1830s, 1840s until the First World War, and then destruction since then. So I saw there's a causality here. It is not monetary stability which central banks create, it is monetary chaos which they create. The evidence, it seems to me, is quite compelling. There are the sources. To rub a bit of salt in their wounds, these are official statistics from the RBA, from the US Bureau of Census, and from the Bank of England's inflation calculator. On inflation, it's been covered in great detail, but it's important to make a couple of what are elementary points, but to repeat them as clearly as one can. We've seen central banks don't create inflation, they don't fight inflation, quite the contrary, they manufacture it, they create it. We've just seen what seems to be strong evidence of exactly that. The shift over the years, what used to be a commonly understood definition of inflation, has left a sinister legacy. I'm drastically simplifying. Pre-Keynes, what was inflation was an inflation of the supply of money. In Mises' terms, the creation of fiduciary media. Now it's utterly confused. The confusion is between the cause, the monetary expansion, the creation of the fiduciary media, and one of its possible consequences, that's to say, the consumer price index. The trouble, of course, is that the consequence of inflation, this is a river which can follow various streams. In the 1970s, in Goff's and Malcolm Fraser's day, CPI manifested, or inflation manifested itself at the checkout at Coles and Woolworths. In John Howard's day, it manifested itself in financial markets. We've had high inflation in Australia. The creation of money has been just as high as in other Western countries. To regard Australia as a low inflation country is to indicate one's economic illiteracy. On that point, a Hayek quote from the Wall Street Journal in the late 1970s, important to repeat, if not every day, every morning, once a week or so, should do it. Practically all governments have used their exclusive power to issue money in order to defraud, important point, and plunder the people. Therefore, he asks the editors of the Wall Street Journal, could you please print in front of every issue the headline letters, the simple truth that inflation is made by government and its agents, nobody else can do anything about it. It might do you some good. The point was made in one of Professor Hopper's addresses yesterday. In effect, his idea, my words, if you do it, it's theft. If the Commonwealth government does it, it's called fiscal policy. If you do it, it's counterfeiting. If the RBA does it, it's monetary policy. If you do it, it's genocide and mass murder. If Julia and Kevin do it, it's foreign policy with regrettable collateral damage. There's a fundamental disconnect. Morality, which we can agree for private individuals, is reprehensible. For some bizarre reason which is left unstated, is regarded as a virtue by the state. That created a real problem, a plague with no name. This is a quote from Mises, from Human Action. The semantic revolution, which is one of the characteristic features of our day, has also changed the traditional connotations of the terms inflation and deflation. What many people call inflation or deflation is no longer the great increase or decrease in the supply of money, but its inexorable consequences. It's no longer the cause, it's one of its consequences, the general tendency towards a rise or fall in commodity prices, wage rates. This innovation is by no means harmless, plays an important role in fomenting the popular tendencies towards inflationism. If we don't know what it is that's the cause of our troubles, we're going to have a devil of a time diagnosing it. I mentioned the constructive fraud of fractional reserve banking. Because the point's been made, I'll proceed quite quickly. There's a deposit, which is a claim on current goods. A loan is a claim on future goods. It simply bastardizes the English language to regard them as synonyms for a bank to lend a deposit, a source of the fraud. It seems to me a woman is either pregnant or she's not pregnant. The present is the present and the future is the future. To confuse the two leads to all manner of mischief, namely the business cycle. If a bank lends a deposit, then whether the depositor knows it or not, and whether he likes it or not, from the depositor's point of view, he no longer has a deposit, he has a forced loan, which probably was not part of his intention. I'll skip and just make one final point re the fraudulence, it seems to me, of fractional reserve banking. I've mentioned the American Finance Association meetings. At those meetings, it's not at all unusual for finance academics. In effect, they are atheists of the Richard Dawkins school. They are incredibly disproportionate number strident atheists. And yet, without the slightest embarrassment, they assert that something in the secular world can be created out of nothing, which seems to me, to put it extremely mildly, is something that they should think very carefully about. It doesn't trouble them. They proceed happily on their way and lead others to what seems to me is disaster. Stimulus has been talked about. I'm going to skip over these slides. The point's been made quite well. Stimulus is dumb. It doesn't work. It makes things worse. The book's two recommendations are very simple: to repeal, the Reserve Bank Act 1959 and the Currency Act of 1965. All deposit-taking institutions must conform to traditional legal rules and principles. This means A, the repeal of the Banking Act, and related financial legislation. APRA, ASIC can be kicked overboard as well. Maintenance at all times of a deposit-taking institution of a 100% reserve, not a fractional reserve, and the punishment of fractional reserve banking as constructive fraud. This is virtually identical to Rothbard's prescription. It is basically identical in an Australian context to Jesus Huerta de Soto's prescription in his dreadnought of a book of, 3-4 years ago, the English language editions. At the heart of these recommendations, if it is not justifiable that if you do it, it's theft, and the government does it, it's taxation. In other words, if one morality needs to prevail, the consistent enforcement of all contracts by exactly the same standards and without any exceptions. This was a point raised in a dinner time address last night. Fractional reserve banks lose their state-sanctioned privileges. If you want security and entrepreneurial profit, then you're asking for something which is logically simply impossible. If you want a deposit, you have a deposit. There it is, money for safekeeping. If you want entrepreneurial profit, you lend to the bank for a specific period of time. The two are chalk and cheese. They are fundamentally different. To confuse them leads to endless mischief. And not to put finer point on it, something that violates elementary rules of logic. Where does this lead us? I'll add a few embellishments, slightly from an investment point of view, but basically elaborating something that was on the cutting room floor from the book. The point is this: several years ago, people would have flatly rejected that big American banks or big European banks could fail. They have done so it's no longer particularly controversial. As recently as a year ago, the mainstream hotly disputed, denied, rejected the very notion that a member state of the EU could become insolvent. Now the mainstream tells us, well, is it going to be a very messy insolvency, or is it somehow going to be a clean insolvency? So the insolvency of the nation state is no longer particularly controversial. I add a twist to that the bankruptcy of the central bank falls perfectly within that logic. I've put up a balance sheet. A central bank purports to be a bank. Here's a balance sheet. On the left-hand column are its assets. In this instance, we have, count them, $1 trillion of one-year government bonds. They have a yield of 0.25%, 25 basis points, 0.25%. $1 trillion of assets. On the liabilities and shareholders' equity side, we have $500 billion of paper currency. This is the stuff in your wallet, stuffed under your mattress, that you give to your kids as lunch money, etc., etc. We have $150 billion of paper currency notes held as reserves in banks' vaults. So the central bank, in effect, it's not the people's bank, it's the banker's bank. And we have what, in effect, are electronic entries, $250 billion of electronic reserves on deposit with the central bank. A balance sheet has to balance. To make it balance, we have $100 billion worth of shareholders' equity. For sharp-minded people, sharp-eyed people among you, this is a greatly simplified representation of the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve circa 2007, pre-quantitative easing. Here's another balance sheet. You're Ben Bernanke, and you decide for